Bullies on the bleachers. A quiet janitor's storm rises at dawn. Quincy Hale moved through Stuyvesant High School like a rumor in the morning light. A man with a mop and a map of hallways burned into muscle memory. The kind of presence that feels almost invisible until it isn't. And in the daylight that seeped through tall windows, he wore the same routine as a uniform. A quiet nod to the custodial cart, a careful step around the floor vents, a practiced glance that stitched together every detail of the day before and the day to come. He had been at Stuyvesant for years, not as a spectacle, but as the quiet backbone that kept the place from slipping into chaos, and the students learned to navigate around his quiet, unless they needed a clean board, a fresh floor, or a reminder that some doors stayed closed unless you learned to respect the person who kept them that way. His appearance matched the role, slim, unassuming, with weathered hands that carried the ghosts of long hours spent kneeling on tiles, and eyes that missed nothing yet chose to say nothing, a man whose voice carried a soft, certain rhythm when he did speak, which wasn't often, because the school ran on the unspoken contract that janitors were there to serve the living, not be the story. The campus itself, a sprawling, slightly worn leviathan of brick and glass, felt like a city within a city, a place where the cafeteria hissed with steam and gossip, where the hallways breathed with crowds during passing periods, where the science wing smelled of copper and sharpness, and where the gym echoed with the clang of metal and the whispers of futures being formed in real time. The real world pressed its fingerprints on the floor tiles and the ceiling tiles and the girls' locker room where the morning light fell in clean slants, and it was here that the quiet janitor moved with the kind of patience that the loudest kids rarely understood, the patience that would eventually bend toward something decisive. He had not come to this school recently, nor was he a stranger to the rituals of high school life, and this familiarity, that almost invisibility, was both shield and cage, because when people know you well enough to forget you exist, they might forget to guard themselves around you, too. The bullies arrived as they always did, in a pattern that felt rehearsed to anyone who took notes in secret, though the teachers never seemed to notice the choreography. Damon Reed led the trio, tall and sunburned from the field and the sunlit afternoons behind the bleachers, with a swagger that looked like a dare to gravity itself, a grin that rode his mouth like a ledge, and a plan that didn't require much planning because it sprang from the same well of certainty he wore on his sleeve. Colby King followed, lean and quick, with a laughter that cut through the crowd the way a sneaker cuts a corridor floor. And Troy Vance rounded them out, broad-shouldered, a quiet force that landed heavier than his words did, the kind of presence that didn't belong to the underclocked, but to the storm that always waited in the wings. They didn't pretend to be friends with the janitor, but they knew the tempo of his days. The way his cart slid past with its rattling wheels, the way he paused to adjust a floor sign, the way his eyes momentarily traced the floor patterns, as if reading a script only he could see. And so they allowed themselves the luxury of a first interaction to confirm who he was and then move on to the ritual only they fully understood. The first interaction came in the morning near the cafeteria, a place where the noise gathered like a weather system around steam tables and the clatter of trays. Damon in particular found it amusing to test the quiet, and the moment he approached, their eyes aligned for a heartbeat and the world drew a breath. Damon's voice, when he finally spoke, was not cruel so much as practiced, a rehearsed casualness that could cut through a room if it needed to. "On your rounds, Hale?" he asked, a sneer tucked into the corners of his mouth, the way a gymnast hides a trick in a routine. Colby and Troy stood at a polite distance, arms folded, as if a manager had paused the scene for a moment to remind the players of the stakes. "Just trying to keep chaos to a minimum, Damon," Quincy replied, his tone even, not challenging, not appeasing, simply stating a fact that didn't invite arguments. The others laughed at the polite exchange, the kind of communal laughter that travels in a line and makes everyone inside its reach feel a little smaller, a little more on edge. There were old rumors of the janitor's past, told in whispers by students who believed in legends, that he had once trained in something fierce, something that came with a dangerous grace, and the glances he allowed to flick toward the trio suggested he knew the stories too, but those stories stayed tethered to an earlier life, dormant until the right moment came to wake them. What followed was predictable enough to anyone who had watched enough decades of school life, a pattern of small humiliations that stitched themselves into the day like stitches to a wound. In the hall near the science wing, Damon slid a shoulder into Quincy's cart as if redirecting a stubborn obstacle, and the cart lurched. A bottle toppled, orange liquid spritzed across the floor and splashed on Quincy's shoes, the sticky sheen catching the fluorescent light and turning his quiet work into a slow, slippery embarrassment. In the cafeteria, a joke about the janitor's special recipe for cleaning products echoed, a chorus of choked laughter that rose and fell with the clapping of hands. In the gym corridor, a chair toppled, not by accident, but with a purpose, and Quincy found himself squatting to stabilize the cart while the bullies hovered with their breath held like a dare they didn't intend to lose. Through it all, Quincy's thoughts moved in a stubborn rhythm. This isn't about me. It's about their fear of staying small in a room full of bigger, louder stories, and I won't make their fear bigger by fighting in their arena. He had learned long ago in a life outside the halls that there are lines not to be crossed, reasons not to answer violence with violence, even when the other side makes that choice for you. The decision to stay quiet wasn't fear so much as a deliberate act of restraint. A choice to protect something beyond himself, something fragile and valuable that could shatter with one wrong move. As weeks turned to months, the bullying settled into a new rhythm, less like a storm and more like a weather pattern, still uncomfortable, still invasive, but predictable enough that Quincy could anticipate it. And with anticipation came small changes inside him, the way his shoulders lowered into a more natural stance, a steadier breath when the bell rang, the way his eyes, which had watched from the margins, began to linger a moment longer on certain faces in the hall that offered a kind of unspoken acknowledgement that maybe someone was noticing him back. In those quiet moments, Ari Collins, a robotics club star with a shock of auburn hair and a mind that moved as quickly as her fingers on a soldering iron, started to appear in his periphery, in places where she didn't nearly belong. The hallway near the science wing as he pushed by with his cart, the edge of the library where the light hit the glass, just so. The bleachers after a late practice, where a porous friendship between the school's quiet heroes formed and dissolved, like a breath in cold air. Ari carried herself with an integrity that didn't demand attention, but demanded respect. A trait Damon and his circle didn't understand until they saw it in others, until they learned that quiet can be louder than noise when measured in consequences rather than volume. And Ari, despite the way the day's cruelty brushed against her like a storm, stood tall in her own small way, a target not of direct taunts, but of the way the sidelong glances and half-smiles from the crowd stitched her to the same jagged edge as Quincy, and he, in turn, found himself drawn to her, not out of romance alone, but out of a shared understanding that some battles must be met with more than endurance. The middle rising action grew from a single, devastating incident, a cruel, meticulous plan that the trio pulled off with the choreography of a heist. A single act meant to strip away both of them, the janitor who stands in the margins and the girl who stands out in the crowd. It happened during a school assembly in the gym, a moment the entire student body would remember long after the last pep talk, the very space where energy was poured into the room and expectation hung like a banner across the bleachers. Damon, Colby and Troy cornered Ari in the front row after a demonstration that had required all the courage she had, a moment that should have been a triumph for someone who had fought to belong in a place that never felt like a home. Instead, they used the moment to humiliate her again, whispering comments that she could hear with perfect clarity, the kind of words that aim like a needle and then leave a thread of doubt behind. And as the crowd's attention narrowed to the stage and the lights, Quincy felt something in his chest shift from the slow, patient rhythm to a pulse that demanded he act. The humiliation was not just hers, it was a test for him. The moment at which he finally realized that his restraint might be mistaken for apathy, that the pattern of not fighting back was ending not with him, but with someone else's pain, that he would not allow to go unchallenged. The breaking point came when Ari's eyes met his for a fraction of a second during the final moment of that assembly. And in that second, something dangerous awoke in Quincy. Not fear, not anger, but a careful, surgical clarity that had never been his to unleash in a school setting, but was real, felt in the bones, something that had once kept him alive in other circumstances. The decision to act did not arrive as a shout, but as a quiet seam of resolve that opened within him. He began to practice, not the kind of practice that required a gym and a dojo, but the kind that existed in the hush between bell rings and the soft scrape of a cartwheel across the floor, in the way his hands learned to anticipate a shift in balance before it happened, how his legs remembered the geometry of a takedown without the need for noise or spectacle. He studied the way people moved in a crowded hallway where the line between restraint and reckless action lay. How to turn a smaller force into a lever that could tilt a larger one without the need to break anyone's dignity. It was not a public training montage with punchy music, but a slow formation of skill and nerve that happened in the quiet hours in the back corridors and maintenance rooms, where a man who had spent his life cleaning up after others learned to clean up a different kind of mess, not by destruction, but by redirecting it toward a just, controlled outcome. And while he trained, a couple of teachers started to take notice. One in particular, Mr. Donovan, a history teacher with a soft voice and a stubborn sense of fairness, who whispered to him after a late shift that what we're capable of when we choose to stand for others can redefine who we are. The climactic confrontation arrived with the precision of a timed maneuver and the simplicity of an almost ceremonial act. Damon tried to escalate a simple shove into a spectacle in the library, where Ari, now surrounded by a circle of orbiting students, stood with her project in a tote bag that contained a delicate, irreplaceable prototype. A device she had built that could map magnetic fields with uncanny sensitivity, something that could earn her a scholarship or a dozen more doors if given the chance, but which the bullies would ruin in a moment if they got their hands on it. Ari's eyes searched the room, and when the crowd's breath hitched and the noise rose into a roar of approval for the show, Quincy stepped into the line of sight with a calm he hadn't shown in years and spoke at last. Not to Rome a verdict, but to the room itself. He asked for a moment, he asked for respect, he asked for a chance to end the cruelty without becoming what they were trying to force him to become. What followed was a demonstration of the restraint and power he had learned. He did not fling a punch. He moved with the quiet precision of a veteran, using leverage and balance to unseat Damon with a single clean pivot that brought Damon to the floor in a controlled takedown, a move that looked almost choreographed in its efficiency, a technique that did not leave a mark, but did leave a message. The strongest force is not brute strength, but a disciplined will that chooses to dominate a moment by mastering oneself. The bystanders gasped and then clapped in a scattered, half-hearted rhythm, unsure whether to cheer or fear, while Ari looked up with a mix of relief and astonishment, as if she had anticipated this exact arc and yet had not believed it could ever happen in the very room where she had learned to doubt herself. Damon's crew froze, the air between statements and actions turning thick with disbelief, and the realization that they had underestimated Quincy crashed into them like a door closing with a decisive click. When Damon tried to rise with a pompous growl, Quincy extended a hand, not a weapon, and offered a measured speech about accountability, about the unspoken rule that strength is tested not by how hard you push someone down, but by how you lift them up. And as the crowd shifted, some students stepping closer, others stepping back, a sense of justice that did not feel punitive descended like a dawn after a long night. In that moment of controlled upheaval, something about Ari's gaze shifted toward Quincy with a new acknowledgement that bordered on something gentle and brave, a bond forming in the shared breath of relief and awe. The quiet janitor, who had kept his own counsel, suddenly found himself the center of a new kind of attention, not the attention of fear, but of respect, the kind that travels on the wings of the bystander who had waited for someone else to stand up and who now saw that someone had indeed stood, and stood well. The aftermath did not erupt in a carnival of revenge. Instead, the school began to inhale differently, as if a weight had dropped away from the air, and the bullies, abashed and bruised in a way that spoke of more than physical pain, found themselves faced with the consequences of a choice they had never learned to explain to a crowd that understood the subtlety of power better than the loudest taunts could show. Damon, for his part, did not apologize with grand phrases. He whispered a rough, reluctant acknowledgement that the day's events had changed something in the room, and the room returned to itself with a cautious, tentative recalibration, a slow re-weighing of people's words and the implied scalars of strength. The teachers who watched from the periphery, Mr. Donovan among them, felt a quiet shift in tone, as if a line had moved and everyone saw where it now lay. Ari, who had endured so much and who had carried herself with a combination of stubborn grace and eagerness for knowledge, stood a little straighter, and Quincy in turn found that his chest no longer carried a hollow space of precaution, but a new, steadier rhythm that fit the room and the future in a way he hadn't suspected. The resolution of the day did not arrive with fireworks, but with a confession spoken in the hallways by those who had watched and said nothing for fear of becoming the next object of derision. The school dynamic began to shift as students, both old and young, began to admit their complicity by doing nothing, a quiet, collective apology that did not come in words from the faculty alone, but as a subtle moral elevation in the eyes of those who suddenly found themselves more accountable to the person they passed by each morning. The bullies carried a look of uncertain pride that turned to something more chastened as the consequences of their actions crept into their social circles, and the new respect they felt, however reluctant that respect might have been, was not a trophy, but a responsibility they had to wear with more care. Ari's relationship with Quincy, an admiration that had grown not into a romance of dramatized leaps, but into a partnership of mutual defense, support, and shared curiosity about a world that was larger than the hallway where they had first crossed paths, became a quiet anchor for both of them. A reminder that trust is earned in small, steady acts as much as in grand, dramatic gestures. In the eyes of the student body, the janitor who never sought to be a hero became the unexpected exemplar of the idea that leadership can be a practice of restraint, not a display of force, and the idea that standing up for yourself can be an act of mercy toward those who need it most if you refuse to become the thing you despise. Quincy's final reflection came in the quiet of the last bell, when the hallways emptied and the school exhaled, a moment of stillness that felt almost sacred. He stood by the maintenance door to the boiler room, hands resting on the cold steel, listening to the distant clangs as if they were anchors to a different life, and he thought about his secret strength not as a talent for fighting, but as a deep capacity for choosing the right action at the right time. A power built not to conquer others, but to shield them from cruelty and to preserve a sense of dignity in the fragile hours between battles. He thought about what it meant to gain respect without becoming a bully. He understood that the moral compass does not glitter in triumph, but hums in the quiet, steady now, the kind of truth that isn't celebrated with a flash, but recognized by those who refuse to abandon what matters most when the room grows loud and dark. As he pushed his cart through a corridor now calmer, he found Ari waiting with a small, grateful smile and a prototype in her bag that had survived the storm. And with that quiet moment, the school's atmosphere shifted again, a subtle but undeniable softening in the air, a commitment from many to try to intervene rather than to overlook, to give space for those who learn to rise without needing a stage. The transformation was not a single climax, but a long, emboldening arc. The kind that shows justice without cruelty, the kind that transforms fear into resolve and ridicule into accountability, the kind that teaches a new generation how to stand up for themselves without crossing into cruelty. And the moment of finality came, not with a shouted apology or a dramatic courtroom scene, but with a single, shared breath of relief from the hallways. A quiet agreement that the world could be changed, starting with a janitor and a girl who had once believed she did not belong, and that belief turning into action when the right allies stood beside you and refused to let the story end in humiliation. Quincy did not seek applause, and he did not seek vengeance, but his posture, his careful firmness, and his restraint when the moment demanded force spoke for him better than any words could, and Ari's eyes, bright with a new courage, reminded him that admiration can be a powerful force when paired with truth, and that by choosing to protect what mattered most, they had changed a room and possibly a future. And the lesson remained clear to anyone who would listen. Resilience means standing up for yourself in a way that preserves your humanity, and it is possible to emerge stronger without ever becoming the bully you despise. And the moral of the story, the quiet, unassuming man who decides to act with mercy, would echo through the halls of Stuyvesant High for years to come, encouraging anyone who had been humiliated to find their own calm, their own plan, and their own way to rise.